Wilbur Ross, the man, the myth, the legend. I'm going to be honest. When in 1999, I remember I was playing a lot of poker at the Mayfair Poker Club in New York City, and there was a guy there who worked for Wilbur Ross, and Wilbur Ross was running huge private equity funds. He started his own private equity fund, WL Ross, and he had a very just solid, unique style of investing and building businesses. And I was a little jealous of this guy because I wanted to work for Wilbur Ross. And Wilbur Ross has just been a consistent feature in just building businesses decade after decade. And then more recently, he was Secretary of Commerce all 4 years of Trump's administration. He served the entire 4 years. And he just had a lot. He has a lot to say about building businesses and about what's going on with the economy and what he thinks about different policies. But he has a new book out called Risks and Returns about his 55-year career building businesses and being in the government. So I can't believe I spoke to him. Here he is, Wilbur Ross.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show.
I really enjoyed the book quite a bit. You're a personal slice of history.
Oh, well, thank you very much, because you must read a lot of books, so I'm grateful you like this one.
This was so enjoyable because A, I've been a follower of your career for so many decades, and B, just your insights into all the experiences you've been through, whether running WL Ross or your experiences in the coal industry, the banking industry, and then of course as Secretary of Commerce and so many other things. So it's been a fascinating ride you've been on. You found yourself at the center of history so many times.
Yeah, I stumbled into a lot of things.
I wanted to ask you, if you could describe specifically, I always wonder, what does the Secretary of Commerce actually do? What do you have power over? And you describe this in the book, but just for our listeners.
Sure. Commerce is a very large conglomerate within the U.S. government. We have everything from the Census Bureau to managing 16 space satellites, to the National Weather Service, to the Patent and Trademark Bureau, to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, to the National Institute of Science and Technology, to minority development aid agencies. It just runs the whole gamut. And in fact, 40% of all the factual material emitted by the federal government comes from commerce. A lot of those reports that come out 8:30 Wednesday morning or 8:30 Friday morning, a lot of those actually come from the Bureau of Economic Analysis in commerce. And then on top of all that, you have the trade situation, both tariffs on imports and export controls on militarily sensitive products to keep them from going to potential enemies. So there's an awful lot of activity. It also, as part of all these activities, we manage the Office of Space Commerce, which is getting to be a very important activity, and will be, I think, even more important as we go forward.
By the way, I agree. Right now, I'm in a hotel, as you might surmise, and I'm at Midland Spaceport in Texas because they're doing a ceremony here celebrating kind of the opening of this new spaceport.
Sure. Well, I attended the first real innovation that Elon Musk had contributed to space, and that was at the Kennedy Center in Florida a few years ago. He developed the idea of making reusable the aft section of the launch mechanism. And that's about 70% of the cost. So I watched with amazement as the rocket got to about 40,000 feet. This part disengaged, landed within a 200-meter circle, nice upright, not destroyed. And it changed the whole economics of space launches because you can imagine if your most expensive component you can now use 10 times instead of one time, it's a remarkable cost saving. And bringing the cost of space down is clearly going to make it very accessible for multiple uses.
But it's interesting. You talk a lot in the book about, or particularly during your tenure as Secretary of Commerce, about the bureaucracy of government and often kind of the frustration of dealing with all the red tape and slowdowns. Is it possible for entrepreneurs and innovators, like let's say an Elon Musk, to really make the greatest innovations in an area so highly regulated? Like, will there be continual space innovations? Because this is a heavily regulated area.
Well, a couple of answers to that. President Trump, as you know, has announced he's thinking about this efficiency commission to try to help him rework federal government. And he's talking about Musk being very, very involved with that. I think it's a fascinating idea because if there's anybody who's filled with new ideas, new ways to do things more efficiently, and certainly one of the leaders is Elon Musk. I had the great pleasure of touring his factory out near the LA County Airport, and it's amazing. It looks more like a laboratory. Everybody in white, they have the little booties on, they have the hairnets on, and rockets obviously have a lot of welds to them, and it's very important that the welds hold, because if you have any kind of a slight blow through, it's going to ruin the whole thing. So he's developed a system where there are two devices that climb up and down inside and outside the rocket. One does the welding, the second one inspects it, and if there's a defect, it orders the first one to come back. It's a totally automated thing. And so he's been making these rockets with a lot less manpower than they had before. And between that and pushing for reusability of key parts, he literally has single-handedly changed the economics of rocketry.
Now, what other industries do you think have seen similar innovations in recent years?
Well, clearly, everything to do with computers, with software, artificial intelligence now is the new incredible frontier. And in fact, I had an interesting experiment with AI. Henry Kissinger's 100th birthday party was coming up about a year and a half ago, and he and Eric Schmidt had just put out a wonderful book about artificial intelligence. So
Very good book.
Yeah, so I thought I would give a test to AI in connection with Henry's birthday. So I figured AI probably was not very much invented to do poetry. So I asked the AI to do a poem in honor of Henry's 100th birthday. So there was a pause, and then out came the statement, "I'm not actually very good at poetry." So it came with a little jumbled thing that didn't amount to much. So 5 minutes later, because I wanted to see if it could learn, I asked the exact same question. This time, out came 10 lines of poetry. Wasn't really poetry, but at least the last word on the lines rhymed. So it was a progress. 5 minutes after that, I asked them the same question. And now out came 30 lines of iambic pentameter. So in the space of 15 minutes, it went from probably never having been asked to make a poem to writing a poem on a very specific topic that worked pretty well. And that made an incredible impression on me. The idea that we had created a device, a system that was self-learning is a real eye-opener.
You know, throughout your career, and your career, as you mentioned in the book, it spans 8 decades. Just even typing that must have made you pause. But throughout your career, it seems like, yes, there were parts that were difficult and hard, but it seems pretty straightforward. Like you worked really hard. As you mentioned several times, you over prepared for every single meeting you went to, and you seem to go from success to success. What would you say was kind of like your biggest failure along the way, like a point where you were actually worried about your future?
Well, in my very first job after I got out of the military, it started out in a very tumultuous and very scary fashion. What happened was this. I had been in ROTC at Yale, and I got a deferment from active duty so I could go straight to Harvard Business School. So after the business school, I served in the military, and then I got extended in my term because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it delayed my advent at work, at civilian work. Now, my new employer was a go-go money manager called Imre DeVay, and he was perfectly willing to extend the job offer until I could finish military. But here's what happened that created the turmoil. 2 weeks before I joined the firm, Imre died, and on his deathbed, sold the business to a very wealthy client of his called Robert Winthrop of the Massachusetts Winthrop family. So it suddenly became Winthrop DeVay. So I literally changed employer before I even showed up for work, and certainly before I got a first paycheck. Well, a couple weeks later, in came one of our major clients, Jack Dorrance, who then was the CEO of Campbell Soup. And between Jack and the pension fund, we had $3 billion under management from them. They were one of our larger accounts. So the lunch was very nice, but he was clearly trying to scope out what was the new group going to be like compared with the very successful performance that the former Imre DeVay had had. So at one point he said to Mr. Winthrop, Bob, I see we have a lot of Lucky Friday silver mine stock in our accounts. Can you tell me why? Well, Mr. Winthrop was used to being a client, not to being put on the spot like that. So he turned to me and he said, Wilbur, do my accounts have Lucky Friday in them? And I said, yes, sir. All of our accounts do, because like most money managers, you try to have symmetry of your portfolio. So then I explained why we were keen on Lucky Friday. And Jack Dorrance said, well, thank you very much. Had enjoyed the lunch. The following Monday, he pulled the $3 billion out from under the firm. So later that week, Mr. Winthrop, who was then on the board of Citibank, was grousing to Dick Perkins, who then was the CEO of Citibank, and he was explaining about this problem that he had bought this firm. Perkins said, don't worry about it, Bob. Take a few $1 million, buy out Sam Milbank. He's the big partner in a nice old line firm called Wood Struthers. They'll call it Wood Struthers and Winthrop, and you won't be put on the spot again. So he did. 2 weeks later, we became Wood Struthers and Winthrop. So now I've changed jobs yet another time and I haven't changed my seat. I've gotten one or two paychecks, that's about all. And this was a firm where I didn't know anyone of the new owning firm and had never applied for a job there. So it was a little scary. But
And so how did you make yourself stand out there so that
well,
you would be
yeah.
noticed?
What happened, and this is what I mean by there being an opportunity lurking inside a problem. Wood Struthers decided to disband the venture capital company that we had as one of our activities. So they fired the entire staff of it, made me a corporate officer, I think largely because I was the newest and most expendable person. And they said, if within 2 years you can liquidate this company and do it without us having to put in any more capital, without any litigation, and without any bad press, we'll give you a big bonus. Well, that's where I learned how to deal with distressed companies because they ranged from some very successful ones that we sold for good prices to some pretty terrible ones that we had to keep alive until we could find some way to resolve them. So that's really what gave me the first background in doing distress. And so it went from being a terrifying experience with all these changes in ownership to being a God-given opportunity. Now, I could have just quit because there were other firms that had been willing originally to hire me. But I thought, no, I'll play the hand out. Let's see how this works. And it really set the groundwork for my later career.
Take a quick break. If you like this episode, I'd really, really appreciate it. It would mean so much to me. Please share it with your friends and subscribe to the podcast. Email me at altucher@gmail.com and tell me why you subscribed. Thanks. When you were at Rothschild and Company and you essentially bought out their venture arm and made WL Ross your venture group, and you focused on distressed and even struggling industries, you kind of had one pattern, which is to take an unloved industry, like let's say coal, and buy up and put together all the distressed coal. This is a time when coal was not, wasn't a hot industry, so to speak. It wasn't like tech or internet or anything like that. And, you created maybe the largest coal company in the world. Maybe this was you did this for steel, you did this for coal, you did this for auto parts. Like maybe describe this strategy and like what, and the roll up concept, why it's such a successful concept to create wealth.
Well, several things. One, industries tend to go bad as industries because there's usually some sort of cyclical factor or governmental factor that comes into play that creates the problem, or even just a recession. So it gives us time to figure out which industries are likely to go bad and to study them so that we can have a game plan for how would you succeed if we did buy something in that industry. So the start of it is pre-planning long before we make the investment. It's usually at least 6 months, sometimes 12 months between when we start to look at an industry and when we put money to work in it. Meanwhile, what we'll be doing is analyzing the individual companies. And what we've noticed over the years is that when companies have been in financial difficulty for quite a while, they develop a kind of loser's mentality. If you ask them what's wrong with your business, they'll always point to some external factor. They'll say it's the class action lawyers. They'll say it's the union. They'll say it's the government. They'll say it's import. They never talk about the things to do with their company that they have within their control and therefore can fix. So the first thing that happens is when you bring to that situation a different mentality, a different mindset, one that instead of moaning about things that you can't control, a new group that's dedicated to controlling the things that you can control. And it may be the last round of expansion went too far. Often it's that an acquisition wasn't properly researched and it went bad. And always it involves too much debt. For give me one dramatic example, there was a very well-known Canadian shopping center developer called Robert Campeau, and he made a hostile bid for Federated Department Stores, which then was a gigantic enterprise. He paid $6 billion for the equity, of which he borrowed 97%. So he had $30 million investment in a $6 billion deal. Well, when the recession came, he suddenly found out you do a lot better collecting rent than you do paying rent. So it went bad. And but as it was going bad, so was Woodward and Lathrop, so were other chains. So that proves the 2 points. One, over leverage, and two, industries tend to go sour as industries.
Right. And then sort of buying the kind of, like, if you erase the debt and let's say erase that last acquisition, rework the
Right.
debt that made it, you're able to buy these companies, start fresh, combine them, get back end synergies, and ultimately bring them public again as bigger, newer companies.
Yeah, absolutely. That was the exact formula that we used. And if you do it carefully, it works pretty well because fixing the balance sheet is in many ways the easiest part because that's what our bankruptcy courts are set up to do. The American bankruptcy system is relatively unique in the world in that our system is organized to facilitate the conversion of debt to equity and the rehabilitation of a business. In most countries, the bankruptcy code effectively amounts to liquidation. So part of the background of why we could do it in the US is our bankruptcy code is very well written, it's very effective, and it lets you take care of the worst of the problems. It doesn't fix the management. And in fact, that's a strange thing. I've found it's very hard to get the bankrupt company's board of directors to get rid of the CEO that bankrupted the company. You would think it would be the first thing they would think of, because after all, the guy brought it into bankruptcy. But it doesn't work that way. And I think the reason it doesn't is that we think that boards pick CEOs. Well, in reality, especially with big companies, the CEOs end up picking the board. And the board members are always their golfing buddies or their sailing buddies or what have you. So there's a unique bond between a board and the CEO that makes it hard on an interpersonal basis to fire the guy. And I think that's one of the causes of the problem.
I mean, you would think that the debt holders, like if you're going bankrupt, that means your debt holders are knocking at the door. You would think the debt holders would insist on and have the power to pick a new CEO.
Well, they ultimately do, and usually we would be acting on behalf of or in concert with the debt holders. And there's one unique thing in bankruptcy. You can do what is called credit bidding, namely a bond. Take Burlington Mills, the textile company. Its bonds went down to around 25, 30 cents. We bought up a lot of them. I became the chair of the Unsecured Creditors Committee. And Burlington was resuscitatable. And Warren Buffett realized that. So he made a cash bid for it. But we were able to bid for it using the bonds at par rather than at the 25 or 30 cents that we had paid. So obviously we positioned ourselves to outbid Buffett. And so I ended up in the strange position of having to convince the bankruptcy judge that the bondholders preferred to take equity in the company rather than cash from Buffett. So it was a very unusual set of circumstances, and it would only happen because of the American bankruptcy system.
It's interesting. You got so much exposure to so many industries through these many years of doing these types of situations, and you saw the ups and downs of each industry, that it was no wonder in 2017, Donald Trump, who was becoming president, asked you to be Secretary of Commerce. I
Right.
mean, and it sounds like you weren't very surprised at this. Like when he made the call to you, it sounds like you weren't very surprised.
No, I wasn't very surprised. I had known him for years because I and Carl Icahn were on the creditor side of the Trump Taj Mahal bankruptcy, the casino in Atlantic City. So I'd known him for 25 years at the time. And after that bankruptcy, he actually hired me to help him in some other matters. So I knew him pretty well. And the way it came to be that I got actively involved was one morning I was on Squawk Box. And at that point in time, which was before the primaries, most of Wall Street was anti Trump. They were either Democrats or they were anti-Trump for that reason, or they were Republican and had some other candidate. So Squawk Box people asked me, well, if Trump is the nominee of the Republican Party, would you support him? And they were, I think, expecting me to say no. I said, well, yes, of course I would. Absolutely. So then I explained why. And my explanation was that he was the only one of the candidates, in my view, that understood how unhappy and had determined for change middle class and lower middle class Americans were. They were sick and tired of having been worked over, losing purchasing power for the prior couple of decades. And I felt that was an enormous societal problem, and that since Trump was the only one who even recognized the problem, he was the only one who was likely to try to fix it. So after that announcement, I started writing editorials, mostly in regional newspapers, taking up regional issues and how would Trump deal with them, and debating people from the left-leaning think tanks. So I got pretty structurally involved with the campaign, and therefore it wasn't a total surprise when the phone call came.
And so, a lot of these issues now, of course, the same issues are rearing their head again in this election, which
Yes.
is coming up. And, and you've been so involved. I'd like to ask you, some questions, relating to from what you've learned as your experience as Secretary of Commerce under Trump. But first, I want to ask, a basic question, because obviously you mentioned like inflation is a critical issue for the middle class, lower middle class, and for everybody, really. This is a basic question, but I'm everybody asks it, what does it mean when the government, quote unquote, prints money? What are they printing? How does that work?
Well, how it works is they simply can issue bonds, and that takes money, that creates money. The Federal Reserve lends banks against their deposits, and then you have deposits. So as you have deficit spending, you literally are pumping cash into the economy. And one of the reasons, probably the major reason, why we had the rampant inflation that we recently have had is that the government pumped too much money in. And when you pump in too much money, and especially if you give it to people who are unemployed, and therefore this is their income, and that's largely what was being done, what happens is you create demand, but since they're not working, you don't create any countervailing supply. Well, with anything, if you have more demand than supply, the way the gap is bridged is prices go up. And that's exactly what happened. The prices went up. At the end of the day, inflation is really a monetary supply issue more than it is anything else. Now, it also breeds wage increases and commodity price increases, but fundamentally, it's a money supply issue.
So look, when you say the banks or the Federal Reserve lends money to the banks, do the banks have to take it? Or I guess if the money is being offered to them, they just take it because it's
take it. But with the Federal Reserve policies setting the prices of borrowing and the whole series of regulatory actions, the reserve requirement, namely what percentage of deposits you have to keep either on hand with the Federal Reserve or in cash, the whole bunch of tools that the Federal Reserve has to facilitate the change in policy that it wants. One of the problems with our system is that you have two components to monetary supply. One is the Federal Reserve's action, but the other is fiscal policy, which is the rest of the government. The Fed is an independent entity, and so it does not operate in synchronization with the federal government. And so what you had happening during the early stages of the post-COVID inflation, what you had happening was at the same time as fiscal policy was operating at enormous deficits, trillion-dollar deficit, the Fed was making money less expensive and thereby, in a sense, creating demand for money. And the combination of those two factors is what led to the runaway inflation. More recently, the Fed has been in a more temperate policy of interest rates and interest rate factors, but the federal government has continued spending. And that's why it's been so hard getting inflation down. The Fed, as it started raising rates, was effectively contracting their part of it. But with the federal government spraying out still more money, it overwhelmed initially the actions of the Fed.
I see. So, and do you think the Fed raising rates the way they have, do you think that's, I mean, it looks like that's put inflation somewhat under control.
Yes, but the federal government still is running huge deficits. If you're running $1 trillion+ deficit, that's $1 trillion more money coming into the equation each year. That's an awfully big number. And so what would have been much more effective would have been to tamp down on the deficit spending at the same time as the Fed was coming in. That would meant that wouldn't have had to raise rates as much as they did. And the danger with them lowering rates, and I have no doubt that they will lower rates starting at their meeting around the 19th, 20th of September. There's no doubt in my mind that they'll start lowering. But if the federal government operates at bigger and bigger deficits, it could very well overwhelm the benefits that the higher rates and the monetary supply had caused, and you could have inflation resume again. So you could have a very cockeyed situation where they solved part of the problem, but they didn't permanently solve it.
So what will be the outcome in the sense that, there's $35 trillion in debt right now, the US, which I don't know if that's a big number or a small number relative to the size of the US economy, but what is the ultimate solution? Like, how does the US ultimately pay down this debt, or do we just pay it down through, gradual inflation through the years so the debt becomes less and less meaningful?
No, the way we can pay it down is with more rapid economic growth. If the economy is only growing at 2% a year in real terms, and if the budget deficit is much more than 2%, which it is, it's running up around 4 or 5%, then you have the inflationary problem. But the way to solve that is right now about 37% of the working age population neither has a job nor does it want a job. It's not seeking a job. If the way the money were spent, encouraging people to work, then you could have a big increase in supply, which would help offset the big increase in demand from the money. But when you just keep piling more money into the hands of people who are not working and don't want to work, that's when you create the worst part of inflation, because you're only stimulating demand and not supply.
And so how do you incentivize, like politically, once people start getting checks, they don't want to stop getting checks. Like politically, how do you incentivize people to work?
Well, that's the conundrum. It used to be in the earlier days, unemployment insurance, unemployment payments were time limited. You could only be on them for a certain amount of time, and they were limited in amount. So you never had the situation where they were relatively permanent. And in the case of the payments after COVID, many of the low income people got more pay, literally more pay, not working than they ever had made when they were working. Well, that's crazy. It's a disincentive to work. And it has led to an antipathy toward work on the part of many people in the population. There's a Reddit site that had 6 million subscribers, and I went on it. It was dedicated to anti-work, believe it or not, with 6 million subscribers. And there were some pathetic things on it. One guy had posted, "I just can't force myself to go to work anymore." Well, the notion that work is an aberration, work is something unnatural, work is something that you have to be forced to do, it's the total antithesis of the American dream. And it's a very destructive thing. We need more labor force participation, and that requires training, both for high-tech jobs and for non-high-tech. There are shortages in a lot of categories of workers, not as many shortages as there used to be, but still quite a lot. And we still have low workforce participation, down around 62, 63%. Well, that means that 37% or thereabouts of the working age population has no interest in having a job. So the other 60 odd percent has to subsidize the 30 odd percent that won't work. It's crazy.
Yeah, so it seems like, again, you always want to tax the behaviors you don't like and incentivize the behaviors you do like. So for instance, to get more people to work, you could lower taxes on income tax, and for people who don't work, you could have maybe a higher sales tax, for instance. So it's a little harder to spend. And but it's politically unsavory to institute such a policy. Like maybe our political system is not really set up to have pain as a prescription.
Well, I think it depends on the party. It doesn't have to be pain. For example, it used to be that your unemployment benefits were limited to 70 or 80% of what your prior pay actually had been. So that had built in an incentive to get a job, because while you had some money coming in, it wasn't as much money as before. So you couldn't just sit back and say, well, I don't have to do anything. So simply making the unemployment payments more proportionate to what the fellow had earned before would help. Also, not giving these subsidies to people who had never had a job. Somebody who's never had a job, but who's getting some of these payments, whether it's for childcare or whatever it is, it's an unnatural situation, but it's a disincentive to find a job. I mean, think about it. If you could make twice as much or half again as much doing nothing as working 8 or 9 hours a day, you would be foolish to go to work. You're better off just to sit home, watch TV, do whatever, and make more money. So it isn't that we have to have a huge disincentive. The current system for many people has been the best job they ever had was no job.
I want to switch tracks slightly to other things you did as Commerce Secretary. A lot of it had to do with trade. One thing I always get worried about is, and you talk about this in the book, you know, the world's reliance on so-called rare earth minerals is very significant. Like you need rare earth minerals to power the electric grid, to make semiconductors, to do so many of the things that are fundamental to how society operates on a daily basis. And China is the number one source of these rare earth minerals in terms of the production and the cleansing of the rare earth minerals once they're sourced. Given that China is sort of an economic enemy and perhaps more to us, how do you solve this problem? Like, China can just say to us, hey, US, stay out of our way, or you get no more rare earth minerals, no more lithium, no more beryllium, whatever it is, you're cut out.
Right. Well, we are in that very dangerous situation, and also in semiconductors, same idea. In both cases, particularly rare earth, China has driven the cost of refining the ore and getting the rare earth into a usable form. They've cut the cost of doing that to the point where it's not economical. They've been subsidizing it. So I believe we have to subsidize our industry in doing it simply as a matter of national security, because we have plenty of rare earth in the ground. It isn't that they are only in China. In fact, they're most importantly not in China. U.S. has big raw material supply for rare earth. So does Canada. So does Australia. So what we need is to create a mechanism whereby the Defense Department or somebody will pay more for rare earth if they come from the U.S. than if they come from elsewhere. And once we do that, it won't matter that China is subsidizing them. It will offset their subsidy.
Now, when you were Commerce Secretary, did you have opportunity to do that? Were you able to make progress on that?
Well, we tried. I actually convened the ministers from Canada and Australia together with DOD and others from our government toward the end of our administration, trying to work out a system whereby all three of us would contribute to subsidies. But we ran out of time in the administration before we could implement anything. And the new administration is not so keen on rare earths because the environmentalists don't like them. The process of making rare earth into usable material is a little bit of a pollutive process, but I just think it's essential from national security. Same thing with semiconductors. We are the world's largest consumer of semiconductors, but we import something like 70% of all the semiconductors we use. Well, semiconductors are in every advanced weapon, every plane. You couldn't even find your way to your friend's house if the GPS went out. GPS runs on semiconductors. Your garage doors wouldn't open. Probably your car doors wouldn't open. So we need to become self-sufficient in each of these key areas. And I think it would be money better spent subsidizing semiconductors and subsidizing rare earth production and refining. A lot better spent doing that than paying people not to work, because then you'd be solving a serious problem in the economy. And meanwhile, to the degree you built up those two industries, you'd be creating jobs. So you would have a much better solution, because now you would have some supply increments coming in, not just the demand increments coming in from subsidizing people not working.
I'm assuming there's a lot of smart people on both sides of the political divide. How come, let's say in the current administration, and I'm not necessarily criticizing them, but how come some of these smart people don't speak up and say, hey, we could be in trouble if just for one day China decides to cut off rare earth minerals to us? That's disaster. Like, clearly everybody knows there's a problem. What do they think is the solution to this problem?
Well, they're talking about solutions, but the problem with this administration is a lot of their social policy issues interfere with economic issues. I'll give you an example. Elon Musk, Tesla, was the real pioneer of electric vehicles in this country and is still the leader. Well, that's a good thing. Government likes that. But this administration will not grant tax credit to people who buy Tesla cars instead of Ford or GM. And the reason is Tesla is non-union. Well, there's a clear example of social policy, namely a policy being pro-union, interfering with an ecological policy, which is to encourage electric vehicles. And so what happens is the policy objectives of the Democrats are so complicated and so mutually contradictory that they get in the way of each other.
And even though the rising potentially national security disaster of not having any new semiconductors, that doesn't kind of get, like, what happens if that gets mentioned in Congress? Are people just shut down, or what happens?
Well, it took years. I was one of the pioneers of the so-called CHIPS Act, and it finally did get passed under the new administration. We were not able to get it through under the Trump administration. But what did the Democrats do? They granted the 50 billion, 50 billion that we were requesting to get state-of-the-art semiconductors made in this country. But they added to it $450 billion of other provisions that had nothing to do with semiconductors, nothing whatsoever. So they took a $50 billion idea that did address the real needs we have for semiconductors, but put on top of it 450 of what I view as very inflationary money.
You know, one of the things that's kind of remarkable about your tenure as Secretary of Commerce is that you were there for the full 4 years.
Right.
I don't know of any other cabinet official that I could think of, and I could have researched this, but I off the top of my head, I can't think of any other cabinet official that lasted all 4 years.
Well, there were a couple, Steve Mnuchin being one.
Yeah, Steve Mnuchin. But what do you think contributed to your longevity there? Like, what did you disagree with President Trump on, but you moved forward despite that?
Right. Well, first of all, I knew him better. Both Steve and I knew him better than most of the other cabinet secretaries because we both knew him from the commercial world. And as a result, I was able to pierce through the style issues, the personality issues that bother some people, and focus on substance. So that was one thing. A lot of these people didn't know Trump, and he is a complicated personality. He's a demanding personality. He's a very powerful personality. So that's hard for some people to live with. But worse than that, because he didn't have a big historic cadre of senior people that he could trust, a lot of the people who initially came into the administration did not agree with all of his policies. Some of the economic people totally disagreed with our tariff policies, for example. So there were some errors inevitably made by picking people who had good resumes but weren't real Trumpers in the beginning. And that resulted both in a lot of turnover and in a lot of leaks because the non-Trump policy people used leaks as a way to try to dissuade him from taking policy actions that he wanted to do. So there was a set of structural issues that arose. And I think now that he's been in Washington, he knows how Washington works, and he knows a lot more people who have the skills needed for the administration. I believe he will have a very good cabinet and a lot less turmoil because it won't be these incorrect personnel selections that occurred the first time.
Do you want to go back as Secretary of Commerce?
Oh, it's a little too early to divide up the spoils. Let's first get him reelected. I think it's very important that he be reelected because I think go back to the 4 years that he was there, the world was a safer place for lots of reasons. The Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians were a little bit frightened of Trump, and therefore they did not act up nearly to the degree that they have with the current administration. Because with Trump, there was the significant danger that if they did push too hard, he would unleash a powerful thing on them. Whereas this administration, it underreacts. It underreacted to the spy balloon. It underreacted to China building up intelligence operations in Korea and Cuba. It underreacted to Russia putting a nuclear submarine in the port of Havana. It underreacted to the Houthis disrupting world trade in the Red Sea. It underreacted to attacks on our bases in the Mideast. It underreacted to a lot of things. And one of the things I learned when I was a kid was that to have a bully, which a lot of these other countries are bullies, to have a bully, you need a willing victim. And Trump was obviously not a willing victim. And unfortunately, I think Biden's administration is being viewed as a willing victim. And that's why they have more trouble.
If Trump was assuming Trump's elected, how do you think he implies that he would end the Gaza situation in a day? How do you think he would end that?
Well, I don't want to second guess the details, but he did have a more peaceful world when he was in office than we've had since. That's a fact. It's something nobody can refute. And it is also the case that he's a very, very good negotiator. This administration has not been very good at negotiating. Remember, they were willing to pay $6 billion to Iran to release a few hostages. Well, I'm all for getting hostages released, but when you have a mentality that pays the captor of the hostages, pays them $6 billion, all you're really doing is encouraging them to take more hostages. So it's ill-considered policy. Similarly with Iran, this country kept begging Iran to go back to the nuclear treaty, which was a terrible treaty even when it was in effect. It did not provide for adequate inspection. We, under that treaty, had to give Iran 30 days notice that we wanted to inspect a facility, and Iran could say no. Well, what kind of a treaty is that to hold down nuclear proliferation? And the very fact that a gigantic, powerful nation like the U.S. repeatedly was begging Iran to negotiate with them is nuts. That's not how you stay the number one power in the world. So I think just correcting some of the process mistakes that the Biden administration has been making, just by correcting those mistakes, you'll improve our situation.
Well, Wilbur Ross, former Secretary of Commerce, very successful investor, entrepreneur, author of the great new book, Risks and Returns, where you really provide such an education on the things you've learned from every aspect of your career. Like, I came out of reading that book with so much more understanding of
the economy, wealth building, and economics, and the mechanics of being a high official for the most powerful government in the world. I highly recommend it. Thank you so much for appearing on the show and answering my very naive and simple questions. I really appreciate it.
No, you did a very good job x-raying these, so I appreciate it.
Thank you.